Hello, my name is Ari Redboard, Head of Legal and Government Affairs at TRM Labs. Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. Today we are hitting super hot topics in crypto compliance with an all-star cast. We are joined by Alfarita Mohammed, Senior Vice President of Compliance at FTX, Brandy Reynolds, Managing Director of the Bates Group, Jamel El-Hindi, Counsel at Clifford Chance and former Deputy Director of FinCEN, and finally, Tom Armstrong, a Compliance Advisor at TRM and former Vice President, Head of Financial Crime Compliance, Digital Assets at Goldman Sachs. Welcome to this ridiculously awesome group, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. So before we dive in headfirst into sort of these hot topics in crypto compliance, I would love to hear a little bit about your backgrounds and really journey to crypto. Alfarita, why don't I kick things off with you?
Sure. So my background starts back in the UK. I went to law school in the UK and then post law school did a brief stint in a law firm and decided I was going to undertake a role in the US with UBS in a compliance role. And then post that, I moved back to the UK. I was in New York for a year, then a different compliance role. Also with UBS. And then after that, I moved to the States again in Chicago in a compliance role, mainly in asset management. So basically various compliance roles. And then back in 2017, 2018, I had a friend who was just getting interested in the digital asset space. And he basically said, you need to read the Bitcoin white paper. And I was like, okay. So basically I had a look and was quite frankly fascinated, and that led me to invest personally in Bitcoin and also ETH. And that was pretty much it. Just like I'm in traditional finance and like invest in this like fascinating new area on the side. But then fast forward a few years from then, I had a different friend who had actually made back in London when I was working at UBS. He was a lawyer and he was like, so I'm working in the crypto space and it's just so interesting. He's like, it's so much more interesting than anything you're ever gonna do in the role I was doing at that point in time. And I decided, okay, I should probably start looking into this a bit more seriously and figuring out like how does my current skill set translate into that world, and what does moving into that world look like? And to be completely honest, it felt like a huge jump. Like it just felt so far away. But then fast forward a little bit further, he gets a role at FTX and just tells me about all the amazing things that FTX are doing. And I'm like, okay, no, this sounds just amazing. I need to get involved and start seriously like figuring out what does it look like to really transition over into the digital asset space. And then this amazing opportunity came about to join FTX. And I guess here I am. But before I move on, I just want to say thank you so much for having me here today, because I'm super excited to do this TRM Talks as well.
Alfreda, thank you so much. It's so much fun to hear about that background, and we're going to get to Tom in a moment. But it's so interesting to have sort of this move from traditional finance to the crypto space. And just as an aside, it's been so much fun to get to know you over the last couple of years, and just really excited to have you on. Jamel, I was lucky enough to work with you quite closely when you were the Deputy Director of FinCEN, and just really excited to see you move into this space as well in sort of in the legal world. Talk a little bit about your background and how you find yourself in the space today.
Sure. So I really came at it as a regulator back at the time, when I was at FinCEN, and we were aware of what was going on in industry. And we had some really smart people. I won't mention them by name, but they know who they are, who brought this to my attention at the time and said, this is something that we're going to have to deal with and get smart with respect to. FinCEN kind of took a lead within the government in terms of getting some guidance out back in 2013. But I'll just tell a really, staff were saying, we need to understand this. Some of them had been dabbling in it and really understood it well. I actually went to one of the first Bitcoin ATMs. I happened to be in Cambridge, Mass for an event at the time, and I looked one up, and I said, well, I'm going to go see what this is all about. Went to the place. It was upstairs in some mall or something like that, and there was a guy sitting outside, sitting right next to the ATM, and so I essentially said, well, I want to see how this works. I'm your regulator, by the way, and we're going to buy some Bitcoin. So I gave him $10 cash. He showed me what to do, and we talked about it. I share that story because it's emblematic of the fact that regulators and industry actually have to learn from each other with respect to this, and it's a continuing process. That $10 of Bitcoin, I don't know. I gave it to my son. I have no idea. I'm completely ambivalent in terms of what the value it is right now, but it was only $10, so I wasn't violating any ethics rules. That's it.
No, that's awesome. And I think that, obviously, I think there's this perception that sometimes regulators don't get this or don't get the technology. And that's something we'll obviously sort of dig into a little bit. But the reality is, certainly at FinCEN, from my experience as well, it's like there's an incredible team there of subject matter experts that are really thinking in sophisticated ways about these issues. And it's obviously it's an amazing place for you to have sort of started. Brandy, I know we can hear you, which is the most important thing. So would you talk a little bit about your journey to crypto and sort of what you're up to in the space?
Yeah, thank you so much. So for me, I started out in compliance a long time ago. Been in this space, generally speaking, for about 18 years, but it really wasn't until about 2015 when I really found crypto compliance. Before that, I was in consumer compliance, BSA AML. But then in 2015, when I entered into the world of consulting, I had an amazing opportunity to work with some very talented ladies that were willing to share their knowledge with me. That was the first time that I was exposed to conducting an independent review for a crypto exchange. And I just really fell in love at that point in time. To me, it was really a lot to do with the gray area, and everything wasn't necessarily so black and white, and having to really think very hard about how to help these companies comply, and what does it mean for them to really stay on top of compliance. It's just new and different. So from really that point in time, I just knew that this was a space that was very interesting to me.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, and just there are not a lot of folks in this space who have this sort of consulting role that you have, but also sort of the full chief compliance officer roles that you've had at cryptocurrency businesses. Do you want to talk for a quick second about those?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me, it has been very interesting in my role as a consultant, because for me, it's not just being able to go in and be on the outside looking in. I have been very fortunate to be an outsourced compliance officer for several large companies in the space, and really have been able to dig deep and work on the inside, and being able to operationalize their policies and procedures, work with them, with a lot of very smart people, and really understanding what it's like on the inside of these companies. And for me, that's just given me great perspective from being on the inside, but then also having the ability just to consult and be an advisor for so many other firms.
Awesome. Really excited to hear sort of about that experience more today. Tom, this is I think for me, maybe an opportunity to really publicly welcome you to TRM. Super excited to have you on our team, and would love to kind of hear a little bit about your background, journey to crypto, and then sort of, your role at TRM.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So, I spent the last 9.5 years at Goldman Sachs, and really kind of grew up in what I like to call the trenches of transaction monitoring in their financial crime compliance department. And it's a really great kind of place to grow up in the AML world, because it's a perfect training ground for kind of tuning your sense of risk, because of the sheer volume of activity that you look at, day in and day out. And I remember this was probably 2014, right after Liberty Reserve became infamous. that I had my first case looking at an issue that tangentially involved, the purchase of Bitcoin mining hardware, and really kind of started to dig in at that time. And at first it sounded just totally bizarre, in those early days. But I could have never predicted the institutionalization that crypto has gone through, at that time. But I felt like it was going to be important for the financial crime space, kind of similar to what Jamel was saying. It felt like this was going to be important and an issue that we had to stay on top of. That really accelerated several years later when I had the chance to lead a couple different teams, a financial intelligence unit and a forensics group, where the mission was primarily focusing on emerging threats, undercovered risks, and what kind of keeps us up at night. And we really dug in and did several different reviews trying to get familiar with, who are the players in this space? What's the exposure to financial institutions? What are the assets? What are the risks and that kind of thing? And that really grounded me in trying to, just get familiar with the space, so that then when Goldman started to expand its footprint, maybe 2 years ago or so, I was tapped on the shoulder to lead the financial crime compliance digital assets team. And it was really, an exciting time to think about what the strategy should be for the firm from a financial crime vantage point, and kind of apply that globally across all business lines. And then, I'll just say in coming to kind of TRM Labs, this felt to me like a chance to kind of reset some of the AML practices that we've had over the years. And, with the combination of the technology, blockchain intelligence, and the lessons learned over the past, 20 years or so, this felt like a chance to really make an impact and do something a little bit different in the space. And so one of the things that we're trying to do at TRM Labs, and my role as a compliance advisor, is not only help bring institutions kind of into this space and help them figure out how to build their programs effectively and to mitigate these risks, but also just to be a kind of white glove service for anyone who has questions or needs soundboarding on trying to figure out the best ways, the different ways, and the safest ways to enter into this space.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Trenches of transaction monitoring is something I might have to steal from you. That was awesome. When I was in AUSA, I used to call it boot camp for trial lawyers, but the trenches of transaction monitoring is definitely a good one. Jamel, I'm going to start with you to sort of level set for us a little bit. Obviously, really what, these compliance professionals on the panel want to keep their ecosystem safe, but they're also trying to ensure that they're complying with their regulatory obligations. If you can just sort of quickly, maybe to high level, sort of what are those regulatory obligations that, compliance officers like Alfreda and Brandy and others are focused on?
Well, let's go back and make sure that we understand that there's a range of compliance obligations. And I'll just go through some of the history. As I mentioned before, I first came to this in the context of AML. National security issues, protecting the financial sector, to the extent that crypto was seen as something that might not be as transparent, or might have even been designed with a lack of transparency in mind in terms of protecting somebody's identity. There was immediate concern within the government, and all of the focus really was in the beginning on AML, sanctions, evasion, and issues like that. And I think with respect to the general understanding of what industry needs to do, it's pretty clear. In this space, there has to be the same type of transparency, the same type of diligence and vigilance that we expect from other parts of the financial sector. So at its core, that's really what it's all about. You have to have systems in place to know who your customers are, know who you're dealing with, identify suspicious activity, report that suspicious activity under certain regimes in certain jurisdictions. You've got to be transparent, and you basically are operating the same way a money transmitter operates, and that's how FinCEN set out its regulations, and a lot has followed from that. But don't forget that there are other parts of government, there are other interests as well. The SEC, the CFTC, Consumer Protection Bureau, IRS, data privacy issues. To a certain extent, there's still a lot that has to be clarified in this space with a host of other legal regimes and concerns. And what I like to point to people, what I like to point out is that when FinCEN first came out with its guidance in 2013, we put in a little footnote that essentially said, we're looking at this at FinCEN from the perspective of money laundering. That is the main equity of FinCEN, and pushing for the transparency. But there are a whole host of other actors in government that need to be looking at this and taking steps to protect their equities. So I think right now, when we talk about compliance, yes, there is focus on what you need to do in this space for AML purposes and sanctions purposes. But I think, even though there's still some rules that need to be sorted out with respect to the travel rule, precisely what needs to be collected, what's the most effective way for meeting some of those transparency requirements. And there will be ongoing discussion between industry and government in terms of how to get there. The basic principle is there, and everybody should be on board with that. That's fairly well designed, but there's still a whole host of stuff that needs to be sorted out, with some other regulatory aspects. And I've mentioned those. I don't know if that's if that's the focus right here, right now, but I think that there's a lot of attention being spent on that. And as a lawyer right now, when people come and they ask, what do we need to do? I make those distinctions very clear and say there's a whole host of things that you need to look at and a universe of things. But let's start with some of the fundamentals in terms of making sure that the national, you're not going to get in trouble, with respect to sanctions of violation and money laundering.
Terrific. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Brandy, let me jump to you for a second, because Jamel mentioned, I think, a number of things that are really interesting. And I like my sports analogies, but I'm gonna try a new one. Sort of, clearly the goalposts are continuing to move. From regulators. How are you? And if you could be as granular here as possible, right? How do you build a crypto compliance program? What are the things that you're doing to ensure that you are not just complying today, but you are ensuring that you're complying with sort of potential regulations in the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So to me, I feel that institutions should really focus resources on horizon scanning and flexibility, including ensuring that the software systems and business rules can be changed, to reflect new regulatory developments. Right now everything is, ever changing, and a lot on the horizon as far as proposed legislation. But really, in the way this environment works, and it's so fast moving, that the institutions, they need to be able to pursue, in my opinion, a conservative risk tolerance, because regulators are taking notice, they are looking. And they will most definitely, in my opinion, make an example of companies who are a little bit more relaxed on standards and where they are putting that goalpost, if you will. So for me, it's much easier to relax controls than it is to have to create them de novo. So we try to really work with companies, and me as a CCO, it's working from that past knowledge that you have and experience and what others have set the stage that works. With that best practice, and then really trying to ensure that you can utilize that to create the framework that you need in the crypto space. To me, this can include measures such as adopting the KYC requirements for more stringent competitors, choosing not to offer more volatile or risky crypto. You're really looking at benchmarks in the industry. And then you're determining from your risk tolerance level where your institution needs to be situated.
Terrific. Yeah, just building on that a little bit, are there, you mentioned a couple examples, sort of questions around sort of what KYC to potentially require, even maybe a little bit more than is required by regulators. Any other sort of examples of decisions that you've made or decisions that you're in the process of making that are sort of that skating to where the puck is headed?
Yeah, for me, I think it all goes back to that risk management and figuring out what makes sense from the internal perspective, and where you can go to sleep at night and not really worry about waking up in the morning and things falling to pieces. And for me, a few things there is there may not be a black and white requirement, for example, to have a formalized digital assets framework. There's not a black and white playbook for how to manage and list your coins on a platform. And so these are things that, in my opinion, are very important to put into practice and into place. It could be also having very conservative or just additional controls for enhanced due diligence. So what are we going to look at that may be a little different, but works for us for managing our clients, or at least those high risk ones, and how to risk rate those appropriately.
That's really helpful. Yep. Jamel, you want to add to that?
I was just going to say, I mean, hearing what Brandy's saying, echoing all of that, even taking a step back a little bit further. I mean, we're talking about what's your risk appetite. Well, people in this space actually have to spend time assessing their business model and what the risks actually are, and some of that is studying and thinking. And I think too often people are in such a rush to jump into saying, I need to have something compliant. I'll work on stuff, but I just need to have something compliant, and they skip over some of the basics of just really trying to understand what the risks are. How could somebody use this in a bad way? Are they really studying that? Don't put your head in the sand with respect to that. It's a very basic step that all financial institutions need to spend. I think they need to spend more time on that.
I agree. And one thing I just kind of, sorry to jump in there.
No, I love this. This is what I dream of. Go for it. Yeah.
I also see, a lot of firms, they really want to just throw a lot of things on paper that sounds really great. And then either they have no intentions of actually operationalizing that, or they don't know how. And I have seen, firms really get themselves into trouble that way also, because now you have, procedural violations, and you have a lot of things that, well, you said you're going to do it, and now you're not. So I just also just caution that many of the firms, especially the startups that we work with, sometimes it's fine to walk before you run, but you have to have that clear path. And to your point, what is your tolerance, and what does that look like for your specific organization? Not because one of the top two big guys are doing it there.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And Alfreda, this is I feel like exactly in your sweet spot. This is what you do, right? You have built this for FTX US. How are you thinking about these types of issues? And when you have built out this crypto compliance program for really one of the most important companies in the space?
Yeah. So firstly, I agree with both what Jamal and Brandy have said. And I think, well, firstly, FTX, we are committed to complying with all laws and regulations that are applicable to our business. So in line with what's already been said, last year, and quite frankly, we're constantly doing this. It's doing a thorough AML and CFT risk assessment. So looking at the products we are offering, what are the risks that we have that are inherent to the products we're offering, inherent to the jurisdictions that we're operating in, to the customers that we're onboarding, and creating our framework and policies and procedures around that. But then to go further into Brandy's point of operationalizing this, what we did was hire the right personnel to do this, making sure they're trained and appropriately educated in order to implement these policies and procedures. And then, quite frankly, with regards to the technological aspects of it, right? So analyzing the marketplace for all the different vendors that are going and making sure that we are selecting best in class. So which vendor are we going to use for our KYC program to verify the data that we're being given, to sanction screen customers as we're onboarding them, right? To screen them from an AML standpoint. And then, I mean, as you know, Ari, we use TRM as one of our vendors on the blockchain analytics side, right? And making sure that we are fulfilling our obligations with regards to the different areas of our program, but ensuring that we're constantly looking at the risks. So building our compliance program, it's been a combination of, okay, taking a step back, we are on the spot side, we are a money services business, right? So we are expected on the fundamentals to have an effective anti-money laundering compliance program. Okay, so now we're going to create those policies and procedures and hire the right people to operationalize them, and then make sure we partner with best-in-class vendors, third-party vendors, to bolster different elements of that to fulfill our obligations, be it around having the thorough ability to investigate a suspicious activity and meet our obligations of filing a SAR, for example. So it's like, it's been a combination of, but mainly I think the fundamental is identifying what our risks are. And as our products evolve and you know, we will continue, like, for example, when I joined, we just had the spot exchange. Now we have, we've added, like, for example, the NFT marketplace, but just constantly looking at the risks in the products and ensuring that we're continuing to evolve. And quite frankly, we have taken a more conservative approach to, like, for example, there's other our competitors that are offering way more tokens than we do, right? But we've taken a more conservative approach in certain areas to make sure that, you know, that we are just taking the risks into account and making sure that we can, you know, our risk tolerance is in line with what we're offering in the market.
Alfredo, this is sort of a question I think I had teed up for a little later, but like, we're kind of rocking and rolling on it. And I think that it really goes to what you are talking about here. So for example, NFTs are a great example, right? There's not a lot of regulatory guidance on how to treat them. FATF has said certain things, but again, FATF is not a regulator, right? The Financial Action Task Force, which is kind of the UN of money laundering. How are you thinking about it? It doesn't have to be specific to NFTs, but how are you thinking about sort of, you know, new technology? And NFTs are a great example because FTX has a very robust, you know, NFT presence. How are you thinking about a space like that really there isn't the regulatory guidance? You know, if you're an MSB, you have to have a compliance program, you have to have a transaction monitoring solution like TRM, you have to file reports, you got to get a license. But what about the areas that are sort of a little bit more vague around regulation?
I mean, I think we definitely are a bit more conservative, right? And that's an element of mitigating the risk of those areas. But like, I think even taking our risk-based approaches, quite frankly, what led us to you, right? Because we had you being TRM, we take a dual layer approach in that sense, and we analyzed the marketplace, and it was like, okay, well, what vendor can we use in that specific example that will give us more coverage, right? So it's analyzing the market and saying, well, these are our current obligations, right? And we will take a best efforts approach to comply. And I think if the regulator does see you taking a best efforts approach with regards to what your current obligations are, and doing your best to analyze what the risks are and mitigate those risks, but not, to Brandy's earlier point, not just writing this stuff down, but acting on it and taking also a common sense approach too.
That's an excellent answer, Tom. Just building off all of this a little bit, this is not new to crypto, right? Traditional financial institutions have been having to try to figure out how to move towards where the regulatory frameworks are going for forever. But I feel like you combine traditional finance with digital assets in sort of a whole new world. How are you thinking about this at Goldman, and maybe a little bit about sort of how you think about it at TRM now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so, you know, we were in a position that I think most people on this call will probably find themselves in, where not only is the regulatory landscape moving, but the business is moving as well, and still developing and rolling out new products and figuring out. So there's two kind of moving targets there for people, which compounds the challenge. I mean, I think, two things that I think we tried to do really well. One is the regulatory landscape includes not only kind of regulatory law, but regulatory expectations. And the latter is, I think, much harder to manage. And so we wanted to, from the beginning, have early, transparent, frequent dialogue with the regulators. Historically, some institutions may have had fewer and far between interactions with the regulators. Maybe it was only upon examinations, or, kind of much, farther communication apart. But, this space just necessitates a much more kind of frequent conversation and dialogue. And I think on the regulator side, as Jamel was saying at the top, there's a real thirst on their end to understand this space. And want to kind of know how financial institutions are thinking about it. An example that Goldman kind of just recently executed was we extended a fiat loan using Bitcoin as collateral. And that was announced, I think, in April, but that first transaction was long in the making. And we wanted to bring in regulators at a very early stage of that, long before the transaction went live, help them know how we thought about the transaction, what we thought the risks were, and how we were going to mitigate those risks. And a lot of that was education on things, including blockchain intelligence tools like TRM. And I think Chairman Gensler has said it well over and over again that don't wait for us to come talk to you, come talk to us first. And so you really have to kind of nurture that regulatory relationship, I think. And then second, and just quickly, I mean, I think this builds off of what others were saying, is that as you build your program, there's a difference between kind of building your program to meet your bare regulatory obligations and building one that mitigates all of your risks. There's some delta there, right? Where, as Alfreda and others were saying, there are things that you are not necessarily required to do, but would be incumbent upon you to do if you were really trying to cover off on all your risks. And when you do that, it provides some hedge against regulatory winds changing. So for example, we developed an evaluative kind of framework that we applied across all digital asset opportunities. And some of those factors that we looked at included, coin and token diligence and licensing requirements. And those are not necessarily traditional AML areas of focus. But if we surveyed the enforcement actions in the space and the legal, the law enforcement cases, and these issues kept coming up. So we felt it was incumbent upon us to really add that to our diligence process and make sure, again, that we're covering off on all of our risks, irrespective of whether there's an obligation for us to do those steps or not.
Tom, that's really helpful. Jamel, basically what Tom is saying is the importance of engaging with regulators. And obviously that's very much a two-way street. Would you talk a little bit about sort of your perspective on that when you were a regulator and quite frankly, now that you're advising clients that are looking to figure out ways to engage with regulators? I mean, how does it actually work in practice? We hear a lot about, public-private partnerships, or you should engage with your regulators. What does it really look like?
I think that just from the personal experience, because the regulators have an appetite for knowledge about what's going on in industry, I was always very open to industry telling me what was going on. And I'll just say personally, I would say, listen, just tell me what's going on, and it all kind of becomes an amalgam. Let's kind of have an open discussion about it. Now, that was my style as a regulator. I actually think it's kind of FinCEN's style as well, but it's not as convenient with every regulator. Because they are developing some of these for tech sprints or innovation or something like that, look for those opportunities to engage in a safe space with a regulator. You're not necessarily going to them with a specific ask or a specific problem. You're talking to them about something general that is going on in industry and how you might be trying to grapple with it. I was always willing to take calls from folks who say, I don't have a question, I just want you to know about something that's going on in this space, and look for opportunities to build those relationships. When you see a regulator at an event, introduce yourself. I think that there's opportunity there in terms of building those relationships. Regulators have to get more comfortable in some of those discussions. They have to be, they have to have the courage to hear things and not feel like just because they've heard something, they immediately have to act on something. And I would also say, and this, I think this touches on something that Tom was getting to as well. I mean, even when there is a lack of clarity in precisely what you have to do with the regulations, you think about the principle. What is the regulator's actual goal? And they state their goals in terms of what they're trying to protect overall. And in FinCEN's case, they're trying to protect the financial sector and make information available to law enforcement to protect the public. Well, NFTs are a good example. Look at how those could be used for purposes that run counter to that, even if there aren't specific regulations on them at this point. That a regulator is going to be focused on this. Look at some of the unregulated spaces out there, and it's not like you have to really read tea leaves to think about what a regulator might be concerned about, not with respect to precise application of the regulations, but the goals of those regulations. And to Tom's point, it's not like you should focus just on the minimum. And there are some in industry, that, okay, they may do that. They've got bottom lines that they need to think about. They want to feel where everybody else is in this space. But I do think that we're kind of in a long period of industry itself separating the good from the bad. Regulators trying to separate those who are on one side of the ledger and those who are on the other side of the ledger, and you'll probably begin to see more enforcement actions against those situations that are the most egregious.
Terrific. Yeah, no, just really quickly, there's a great question in the chat on NFT compliance. In terms of a plug, we did a few months ago a TRM Talks just on that topic alone, what sort of crypto compliance or NFT compliance should look like. So definitely encourage folks to watch that. I will say, look, I mean, there has not been a lot, globally, regulators have not talked about this extensively. We've recently seen some discussion around MiCA, which is a sort of a framework for crypto coming out of the European Union right now, going through the European Parliament. We've seen the U.S. Treasury Department talk about potential NFT illicit finance risks, actually in a white paper on money laundering in high value art. The closest we probably have today is from the Financial Action Task Force, which again, not a regulator, but regulators certainly listen to and pay attention to, and that is, if a NFT is simply a digital collectible, then it is not a virtual asset for sort of compliance purposes. But if it's used for payments or as an investment mechanism, then it could be a virtual asset, meaning you have to have all the compliance controls in place that we've heard our panel talk about today. So again, conversation for potentially another day, but I really wanted to give an answer because it is a hot topic in crypto compliance, to be sure. Another hot topic, Brandy, let me kind of kick this one off with you, is sanctions. And obviously it's a lot of the same tools, it's a lot of the same frameworks that we use for sanction screening. But has it gotten, with the invasion of Ukraine and sort of what's going on there in the Russia sanction space? I mean, how are you advising clients? How are you sort of thinking about sanctions today? And has it changed over the last few months?
For me, I think that it definitely has changed. I think there is more focus on, of course, what is the best practice? How can you ensure that you're staying on top of new lists? What is kind of the norm and that sort? But for me, kind of looking at it from the traditional lens as well as from the crypto side, crypto sanctions program, to me, it requires the three kind of elements, and that's a tool or a method to screen the names, also looking at the wallet addresses, which is kind of the nuance there, and then also how to block from that perspective. Because to me, I work with a lot of clients, and even internally with some of the firms that I have worked in an in-house capacity. It's a little different than the traditional side of you have an OFAC transaction or an SDN match, and it's a little bit more clear cut as far as the process that you would take. And when you get into the crypto or the digital asset side, it can be a little confusing for folks, and to understand that process and what is the best way to manage the blocking of the assets, also making sure that you're reporting and that you're following up and so forth. But to me, these tools, it should be used to screen the customers both at that onboarding and the ongoing basis. And I think for a lot of companies, it's what does that really mean, the ongoing basis? And does it really need to be every time the lists are updated? Can it be more risk-based approach? And can you look at that from a quarterly or an annual rescreen look? And to me, I think one of the things that we've said all along is kind of that risk-based approach, or your risk tolerance. And to me, from a personal standpoint, I would love to hear others' perspectives, but OFAC isn't one that I really have a high risk tolerance when it comes to controls and processes in place for that. And so for me personally, I always like to err more on the side of screening in real time, having processes in place to also update lists as they come out, to make sure that screening process doesn't happen once a transaction has gone through, and then you have a violation with the sanctions list. But crypto institutions, you really need to understand that part of the nuance here too, it's collecting enough information, because we also get asked a lot, well, can we have that minimal approach? How could we have the best possible customer experience? And you have very minimal information to open an account versus what do we actually need for true compliance efforts? And so from my perspective, it's always having some very basic or minimal information, the customers, your full name, the country that they live in, and a date of birth, so you can try to disposition any matches there. But while I see a lot of similarities in the traditional side of the world, if you will, I do see a lot of nuances that tend to trip crypto companies up a bit.
That's really helpful. And Alfreda, this could be for you. Feel free to jump in here. Brandy, feel free to jump back in on this also. Look, I want to ask the tough questions today, right? And sanctions is hard, especially, we don't have any addresses today from what I call the Russia-Ukraine sanctions program on OFAC's list. You've got a lot of names, right? We have other addresses in other sanctions programs like North Korea. How do you, Alfreda, how are you thinking about mitigating those kinds of risks today?
So just before I jump into that one, I want to go back to the NFT question. And on our NFT marketplace, you're subject to the same KYC as you would if you wanted to transact on the exchange, and we have 2 different levels for that. But anyway, back to this sanctions question. So obviously we're taking a dual approach, right? So we're screening, as Brandy mentioned, during onboarding, and that's the names, and we utilize a third-party vendor for that. So during onboarding, we screen the names, but then that's also we automatically set it to screen on an ongoing basis. So we'll be alerted if there are any changes to that. So that's how we cover from the name standpoint, and then we utilize on the transactions. We utilize for on-chain transactions, we utilize TRM to screen all deposits and withdrawals. And as you know, sanctions is a severe risk, and we review any hits for that in real time, right? And then on the fiat side, we don't allow any third-party deposits or withdrawals. So then it will tie back to the name. So effectively, you can't deposit on our platform with a third party. So all of the names that we're receiving funds from have been sanction screened, right? So that's how we're covering it from the name standpoint, and our risk tolerance is quite low. So yeah, that's how we're kind of covering both the fact that you don't have any addresses, right? We are covering on the names, and it's set to an ongoing basis.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Brandy, anything to kind of add to that? Is how you're trying to, how crypto businesses are navigating, some of the holes, if you will, in sanction screening, when you don't have that address.
Yep. And I would say that it's still a little scattered from what I have seen as far as how to navigate those holes. There's a lot of people that are very hungry for that information, that guidance, and the best practices as well. To me, I see a lot of still confusion, and really companies wanting to comply, but also needing, in a way, a little bit more information too. There's an expectation that you're not conducting certain transactions or transactions with certain blocked addresses and so forth. But when you look at it from a crypto and a blockchain perspective, sometimes it's easier said than done. I don't think that it's necessarily as easy to comply as you're on a non-crypto blockchain type of transaction. Alfreda, are you guys kind of in that kind of world also, where some of it is most definitely kind of easier said than done versus you putting some of the OFAC and sanctions controls in place?
So from our perspective, so in addition to what I've already said, we also do we're utilizing IP blocking and also geo blocking too, as extra controls to mitigate the risks that you face with sanctions. But then in terms of I understand what you mean from an easier said than done perspective, but we do have every single person on our platform is going through sanction screening during onboarding and on an ongoing basis, right? So that's it. What is the risk, and then how are we mitigating that risk? That's how we're mitigating that risk. And then similarly with the transactions, we know what the risks are, and then we're mitigating the risk through having the appropriate tools in place, right?
Right, absolutely. I see a lot of the companies who are not utilizing your technology, such as your TRM. They're the ones that are having a little bit more of the difficult time for really having the information and having what they need and the tools in place to be able to more fully comply.
Yeah, no, this is great. Really helpful. I mean, I think just if we're thinking about resources for folks, I mean, OFAC came out with, I want to say it was in October, basically a compliance pamphlet that really described what you should have to include transaction monitoring, to have IP blocking, geolocation in a robust sanctions compliance program. And then the other piece is, and I know Jamel will agree with this one, is read enforcement actions, right? That guidance from OFAC came directly out of a series of enforcement actions where companies were not using the technology that OFAC believed that they had access to and should have been using. Essentially had the information, but didn't know it. So and we're engaging with Iran and North Korea and Sudan and other sanctioned jurisdictions.
I think that goes back to how you build your program fundamentally, though. And as I've already said, so it's like, what are my obligations, right? And what are the risks? So what are my obligations? What are the risks that we have in our business that are inherent to our business, that are external? And then what are we putting in place fundamentally to mitigate those risks, right? So, and the pillar that we have, as I mentioned, is choosing best-in-class vendors to bolster elements of our program.
No, that's awesome, Jamel. What's interesting, I think, and Alfred and Brandy are both getting to, is that the larger exchanges or larger crypto businesses have robust sanctions, AML controls in place. We get a lot of times we'll talk to smaller crypto businesses, maybe in the DeFi space or elsewhere, that are really just building. What if one of those types of businesses comes in to your practice and says, "Hey, I want to comply. I want to ensure that I'm complying. I want to make sure that sanctioned actors are not taking advantage of my platform. But at the same time, I'm not FTX, right? I'm not Coinbase. I don't necessarily have the resources." How do you think about advising clients in that respect?
Sure. Again, and I said this before, you start with that client understanding the actual risks. Where are they operating? Who are they operating with? How do they know who they're operating with? What's the scope or the magnitude? To the extent that they say that they may not have the resources of a big actor. I mean, one reality is they may not be able to take on the same type of volume or geographic area or something like that until they actually have a system in place. I mean, we basically say here there are regulatory risks, and then there are actual risks as well. Make sure that you understand both, and you're prepared potentially to take it step by step. If they're not in the space where they have all of the availability to use these tools, a regulator would look at them and say, well, you've made some decisions to run before you can walk. And I know that has come up before, and there are business incentives to do that. But more and more, that is not going to pass muster with a regulator. I'd say they can talk to the regulators about it. They can talk to industry groups about it to figure out where they should be. But they have to have a realistic sense in terms of what they should take on in their business model when, in comparison with what they're actually capable of doing to remain in compliance.
That's really helpful. Tom, I'm going to start with you, but Alfarita and Brandy, I think you'll have some insights here too. And we're, as always on TRM Talks, we're running out of time because it's been a great conversation. But I think we always get a ton of compliance professionals on these talks in the audience who are either transitioning to crypto, trying to learn a little bit more about crypto compliance. But I think one thing would be really helpful, and all three of you have tremendous experience here, is what are some of the differences and maybe what are some of the similarities when you're thinking about, things like transaction monitoring, for example, in crypto compared to in traditional, compliance programs?
Yeah, I think if the things we've been talking about on this call are really helpful, because as hopefully you can hear, there are a lot of similarities, and the core elements of your program should look identical almost. The one difference that I'll just call out that I think is really interesting in the transaction monitoring space. So if you think about how those surveillances are designed in traditional finance, you're generally scoring two things. One, the risk of your customer, and the other, the risk of the transaction properties itself. Is it first, third party? Is it large? Is it going to a certain jurisdiction? Right? Those surveillances, generally speaking, are not focused on the behavior of the counterparty, because you just don't have that data, right? And I think that's where blockchain intelligence tools like TRM have a really unique advantage, in that that's the scoring, the risk scoring is almost entirely based on the behavior of the counterparty, which to me is a much more kind of telling and insightful data point. And not only that, but as that counterparty's risk kind of changes, as they may interact with more risky counterparties, your risk score is dynamic as well. And so, there's lots of advantages to that you just don't have in the traditional finance space.
Terrific. Brandy, Alfarita, do you guys want to chime into this one?
Yeah, so thank you. So I agree with that. I think one of the biggest differences there would be the transaction monitoring, but also you can get into different just general risk areas also that really need to be focused upon. I think by now most firms, they have a standard BSA, AML, OFAC risk assessment, whether formalized or not, but you're really looking at the nuances that need to be considered for a crypto model, like your coin listing, so your digital assets framework. What are some of the differences with liquidity providers and vendor management? So some of those components that can easily be overlooked, I think should be a key focus. But really, to me, also, I think that the challenge is adapting the compliance process to the unique nature of the crypto space in regard to some of the traditional regulatory requirements not fitting nicely for crypto. So if you think of travel rule compliance and some of those nuances that they're still there. But it's how do we make our framework work within the context of regulations are written a long time ago.
That's a great point, especially in the travel rules, a perfect example, right? The expectation is the same, but transferring data is a lot different.
Yeah, and I look at another one too that sometimes I feel is overlooked, and that's Regulation E compliance. So when you get into the Electronic Funds Transfer Act, and so some of those kind of what I feel are unforgotten in the crypto space that you could possibly impact the business model. So
that's terrific. With the few minutes we have left, and it's so funny, I always end with sort of asking the crystal ball question, sort of what's next, what should we be thinking about in crypto compliance? Someone actually in the chat beat me to it, and specifically wanted to know from Alfarita, what are you thinking about when you're looking down the road from FTX's perspective in particular, from a compliance standpoint over the next, the question was over the next couple of years, but I mean, months are like years in crypto. So what's coming down the pike, over the next, 6 months, 2 years?
Yeah. So honestly, I think for us, it's about just remaining flexible and nimble to whatever is going to come. I don't think, I think we know the landscape will continue to evolve, right? But not like, obviously we have the Gillibrand Loomis bill. Where are we actually going to shake out to with that? Like what is actually going to become into law, right? And then I think I personally am expecting over the next few months, Jamal hinted to earlier, for there to be some sort of, or quite a bit of regulation by enforcement action, right? Just because of what we've seen recently in the market, but also like to your point of reading the enforcement action and amending our compliance program accordingly, and just make sure that we're aware of what's happening. So I do think there's going to be regulation by enforcement in the next 6 to 12 months, and then also just seeing what happens. Obviously, we expect different regulations to come out. It won't be in 6 months, but I think the enforcement piece will be probably sooner than the more long-term regulation that will occur. But from our perspective, we are going to be just basically keeping our ear to the ground, ensuring that we're flexible, constantly analyzing the regulatory landscape, and ensuring that we're complying with all our regulatory obligations.
That's great. Jamel, I'm going to go right to you, just since Alfred had mentioned a few of the areas that you talked about. We have potential enforcement actions coming down the pike. Obviously, there's at least bills introduced in the Senate and elsewhere. Where are things headed from your perspective?
It's interesting. I think they're headed where many of us expected them to head many years ago. The basics of what you have to do, the principles behind the regulations are. Sometimes it takes a certain amount of evolution, both on the part of industry and regulators, to get to the right space. But I actually do think that we're headed to something that will be, even though it's moving fast right now and we see all sorts of changes and everybody's scrambling to keep up, I do think that we're headed to a space where some of what we talk about right now is actually going to be normalized. And it's all going to focus, again, on the fact that a lot of this is not new. I mean, other parts of the financial sector have gone through this before. There'll be some tweaks here and there, but the principles, the principles of transparency, the principles of providing information to law enforcement, the principles of consumer protection, all of those things, those have been around. And there's got to be a willingness on the part of this industry. Yes, people are disruptors, and they're bringing new things. They're bringing new things and new products all the time, but do so with the understanding that protections that have existed in other spaces are there for a reason, and that they will apply in this space as well. And I think we see a lot of industry actors essentially doing that and buying into that. But even that has taken some time culturally, within this space to get there. I see more of that happening, where the culture of this industry does get more and more aligned with some of the thinking in terms of the principles of the regulations in the past, not the details, like that. And we talk about the travel rule as a good example of something that down the road, maybe there's something better, that can be in place, and the regulations themselves can be more efficient, but the goals of those regulations don't change.
No, absolutely. And Jamel just mentioned the travel rule again. Brandy, you obviously mentioned it, a few moments ago. Even just last week out of the UK, there's sort of a new final report on how ultimately the UK will come down on the travel rule and vis-a-vis unhosted wallets and other types of entities. So really just, I mean, the space is constantly evolving. Tom, I'm going to go to you. What's next? How are you thinking, like, as you're advising clients at TRM?
Yeah, I'll give a real specific prediction. So as you look at the kind of future use cases of blockchain technology, I think in the next year, maybe a little bit further out, you're going to see a lot more tokenized kind of real world assets. So your stocks, your bonds, and that kind of thing. And so that's going to provide, and additionally, as the pipes kind of get replatformed, that's going to provide, I think, criminal networks with a newfound ability to really do some interesting kind of money laundering, layering techniques as they go between digital assets, from capital markets to more cash-like instruments. And so I think we're going to need a kind of new, kind of class of AML investigators who are able to, be very nimble and flexible at investigating those typologies across a number of different kind of digitized asset classes. And so that's I think pretty energizing to live up to that challenge.
That's a fantastic answer, Brandy. I'm going to finish with you here. What is next? What is top of mind when you're thinking about crypto compliance as you're building out? What are the things that you're anticipating, 6 months to a year down the road?
I do anticipate just more regulatory oversight. So definitely staying on top of recent, legislative activity, both at the federal and the state levels. For me, I think there's definitely going to be a lot more happening at the state level also. So we're trying to really just kind of gear up for just a lot more oversight from various regulators, and how to manage that from an internal perspective for some of the clients. So for me, I would say that that's probably the number one top of mind.
That's fantastic. And just as a pure like practical example of this, just in the last few weeks, we've seen guidance from New York DFS on the need for transaction monitoring for licensed entities, but also sort of what stablecoin projects should have, in terms of being a licensed entity in New York. So yeah, no, really good points. Thank you all so much for joining TRM Talks. To the audience, thank you so much for the questions. For those we didn't get to, we will do everything we can to answer them. Sign up for the weekly roundup and keep watching TRM Talks. And again, thank you to this amazing panel. And thank you all of you out there for helping us build a safer financial system. Have a great day, everybody.